Before we begin a class on the American government and how it works, we have to pick it up in context. We need to go back in time, actually more than a full 5 centuries before the American Constitution was written. We need to understand the context in which those Americans, those British colonists as they became Americans, wrote their laws, what framed their thinking. So we're going to go all the way back to 1215 in English history, and there we'll find King John, the King of England, signing a document known as the Great Charter. We call this the Magna Carta. The reason we begin there is because it set England on a course of political thinking and political development, and since the American colonies were British colonies and the American political system was based in this context, that's where we begin. When King John signed this charter, what he essentially did was agree to submit to some of the requests and demands of his nobles. There's a lot of history that goes into that we don't need to understand, but what is important is that it places the King of England subject to the law. And over the course of the next several centuries in England, what you're going to see is these nobles forming into a group that eventually will become known as Parliament. The king, of course, stays the king, but there is interaction between the two. And the king does not rule like the kings of other nations. If you look at the kings of nations like France or Spain or the Holy Roman Emperor, for example, they would all be what we would call absolutist monarchs. That is to say, they ruled above the law. Their word was law. Okay? When the king of France wanted something done, he simply announced it and it happened. That is not going to be the case in England. In England, the king is subject to the law. Now, this takes several centuries to evolve. By the 1600s, you actually have a situation where Parliament is going to revolt against the English king. This is Charles I, and there will be what is known in history as the English Civil War. This is in the 1640s. Nobles loyal to Parliament, nobles loyal to the king, struggle with each other. They fight for several years. Eventually, the king's forces lose. King Charles is actually captured and, in fact, beheaded. He's beheaded, and now we have what we call the Puritan Interregnum, or the time of the Oliver Cromwellian period in English history. That ends in the 1660s when Parliament actually restores the monarchy, the restoration. This is Charles I's son, Charles II, brought back into England, and the Stuart monarchy is restored. Things go pretty well, that dynamic between Parliament and the king, until the 1680s, when once again a descendant of Charles I and Charles II, a man named James II, again tries to rule like an absolutist monarch. Parliament again rebels, fortunately this time not in a manner of warfare for a decade. They simply invite a relative of James II, Mary and her husband William, a Dutch king, to come and take over the throne of England. All of that to say this: in the 17th century, Parliament has actually asserted its rights over the king, to where at first they fight against him and then essentially just fire him and get the king and queen that they want. This means that by the 1700s, or by the time the English colonies in America are flourishing, you have a political thought that says the king is subject to the law. In fact, in some ways, the king is subject to Parliament. Now, there are certain other givens that these British colonists or American colonists believe. One of these is that they understood that as English colonists, they were the freest colonists in the world. There will be a revolution. The English colonists will rise up against their rulers in England and fight a revolution, gain their independence, but never because they felt as though they were in some way oppressed or unfree. What they fought for was, and you see this in the writings, the rights of Englishmen. They believed that they were entitled to certain rights, that as English citizens, they were entitled to be the freest people on the planet, and that Parliament and the king himself were taking away these rights. These rights were natural rights. That's another given of the time. There is a certain understanding in the thinking of the 1700s that man is endowed, as Jefferson put it, by their creator with certain unalienable rights. That is to say, man at birth is given rights of freedom, rights of life, rights to own property, and other natural rights that then ought to be codified into the laws of the land. That is to say, when a king or when Parliament make laws, these laws need to be in alignment with a greater law of natural rights. It is not appropriate, it is not fair, it is not fitting for Parliament, for example, to make a law that would take away your liberty. That would be a violation of your natural rights. Something else that they believed at the time. In general, these colonists believed that the more dispersed power was, the better. Again, these are colonists growing up in an English political system. They do not believe in the absolutist monarchs of France or Spain and the way they do business, where the ruler himself is lawmaker, judge, jury, and executioner. They want power divided. We see this in the American political thought with things like the mixed government that we have, where we have an executive branch, legislative branch, and judicial branch. This is something that permeates English political thinking that, again, was distinctive in America. Had we been Spanish colonists or French, that form of thinking that we think is so natural, if you will, would not have been in play. Another idea related to this is that separating those powers need to be in different hands. Not only should there be a legislative, executive, and judicial branch, but that needs to be separate. The person who makes the laws should not be the same person that interprets those laws or decides what they mean. That should not be the same person who enforces the laws. There ought to be different branches of government separating the powers. Now, some things that were in the way of thinking back then have changed. And one of the things that you'll do in this course, I hope, is notice some of these changes over the last, say, 300 years. One of the things believed at the time that our Constitution is being written, at the time of the founding, is that there are inevitable distinctions between people. Frankly, some people are just better than others. I'm not talking about distinctions in terms of, say, wealth or intelligence, although they certainly leave that there as well. But I'm talking about distinctions that some people are just naturally your betters. Usually this was reflected in their position in society. People that were wealthier, people that had some political power, were naturally expected by others to lead, to govern. And you were expected to vote for them, you were expected to look for them, to them for wisdom. There was just an understanding that that was how things were. Some people were just better than others, and that they were entitled, if you will, to rule. That's something that's changed. Something else that's just changed is related to this, and that's there are limits to who should be involved in government. We'll talk about in a lecture on elections how voting rights have changed, but for now let's just understand that in the time of the American founding, there were understandings that certain people ought to be involved in government and certain people shouldn't. Not everybody ought to be allowed to vote. Not every male ought to be allowed to vote. Not every white adult male ought to be allowed to vote. They just don't have that right, and they shouldn't have that right. They have nothing invested in the country. They don't own enough property. They don't pay enough taxes. They have no say in the government, and that was a good thing. That was a positive good. The idea of letting just the average person, the flotsam and jetsam of society, if you will, vote was repugnant at the time of the founding. That keys to another idea. You've probably seen it on license plate frames if you've been to Washington, D.C., and you probably learned it in your 5th grade history class that one of the things the American Revolution was all about was no taxation without representation. Kind of a bumper sticker, if you will, of the American founding. Well, that was the colonial argument, but it wasn't a particularly good one. The colonists, as well as the English political system, all understood this notion of virtual representation. The idea that every member of Parliament, the governing body in England, represented everybody in the American colonies. Of course, people from South Carolina, Massachusetts, New York, whatever, don't have a particular representative in Parliament. Not important. Parliament has your best interests at heart. Parliament understands the context of the colonies, and it is not necessary for you to be directly represented. These statesmen in Parliament have the best interests of all citizens of the empire in hand. You are virtually represented in Parliament. It's the same argument you would make today, whereas if you're, say, a 16-year-old and you have a paper route or some sort of job and you have to pay taxes and yet you don't get to vote on how those taxes are used, well, you know, Parliament, or Congress today, I should say, is interested in you. They pass laws for schooling, etc. So, you know, it's not as though you have to vote to have to be obliged to serve the government. A couple other things that have changed in the modern context, but back then were believed to be true, was that the individual interest had to be sacrificed to the greater good. Again, this was something we'll be talking about when we get to civil rights and the way the court system works today. But at this time, there was a belief that civil liberties were less important than the will of the people. We live in a day and age where individual liberty, personal freedom, is a very significant topic and something that's very much endorsed in American politics. Court cases usually side with those who want personal freedom or personal liberty. At the time of the founding, this was not the case. At the time of the founding, there was not a sense that your personal rights ought to outweigh societal good or the general norm. That is something that was very true then that is not true now. Well, what else is going on that we're going to see in this class? Beginning because of these changes, we're going to see some tensions, and I invite you to kind of keep track of these two particular tensions as we go through this entire course. The first one is that in American history, in American political thought, there is an inherent tension between liberty and equality. We very much believe in America that people ought to be free. We also believe that people ought to be equal. And yet, if you think about those two terms, they're mutually exclusive. How can you be perfectly free and perfectly equal? Let me give you an example. If we're perfectly free economically to make as much money as we can legally, what are the odds we'll all make the same amount? And yet, if the government regulates it in such a way that we all make the same amount of money, well, what sort of economic liberty is there in that? So that's one of the tensions I encourage you to keep in mind. Another one related to equality, a very modern notion, is should we go for equality of opportunity or equality of outcome? That is to say, is the role of the government to guarantee that everybody has sort of a level playing field, to use a phrase, to do their best, or is that an impossibility? Is there no way that we all have a level playing field, and therefore the role of government is to guarantee an equal outcome, that there ought to be certain equalities there? These are some of the tensions we'll be talking about in the class. We're going to move next into talking about how this English political thought manifested itself as these British colonies decide to revolt against England and form a government of their own.